The hand connected with the wall beside her head, not with her skin. A small mercy, if one could call it that. The plaster gave a soft crunch, a spiderweb of fine cracks appearing in the sterile white paint of the hospital corridor. It was a sound absorbed by the building's own quiet hum, a secret whispered between drywall and stud. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching was a reward. It was fuel. Instead, Ilara Vance held her body perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the frayed thread of a button on Dr. Marcus Thorne's expensive shirt. "You don't walk away from me," he hissed, his voice a low, furious thing that vibrated in the space between them. His face was too close, the scent of his cloying cologne, a scent she once associated with success and ambition, now smelled only of rot. "Do you have any idea what I've done for you? Who you would be without me?" She thought about it. She thought about who she would be without him. She would be a woman who slept through the night, a woman who didn't check the volume of her own voice, a woman who could enjoy the simple, uncomplicated silence of her own apartment without waiting for the angry turn of a key in the lock. She would be herself. The thought was so clear, so sharp, it was almost painful. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate. He had not updated the file. In his mind, she was still the timid, grateful woman he had first charmed, the one impressed by his title, his swagger, his performative confidence. He had no data on the woman who had spent the last 2 years meticulously documenting every threat, every slammed door, every casually cruel remark. The woman who had built a fortress inside herself, brick by quiet brick. The corridor was supposed to be empty. It was late, past the shift change, a liminal time when the hospital exhaled. But it was never truly empty. There was always the distant squeak of a cart, the beep of a machine, the murmur of a life-and-death conversation happening just around a corner. He had chosen this spot for its semi-privacy, a place where his authority as a senior surgeon gave him dominion, a place where he could be a monster just out of sight. His grip tightened on her upper arm, his fingers digging into the muscle there. A bruise would bloom tomorrow, a secret map of his rage written on her skin. She looked at his hand, then back to his face, her own expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. What happens next will change everything. His arrogance, her endurance, the sudden intervention of a power he could not comprehend. It all collides in this sterile hallway. If you want to see how this unfolds, how a quiet nurse finds her voice and a tyrant meets his match, subscribe to see the resolution. "I am leaving, Marcus," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not emotional. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same calm precision she used when reading a patient's vitals. The finality of it seemed to shock him more than a scream would have. "You have an obligation," he snarled, his handsome face twisting into something ugly. "An obligation to me, to us." She almost laughed. It was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of her throat. Her obligation had been to the mirage of us he had created. Her obligation was to the peace he demanded, the perfection he expected, the ego he needed her to feed. Her obligation was to shrink herself so he could feel large. That obligation had expired. "Let go of my arm," she said again, the words clear and cold. He shook her then, a single, violent jerk. "You will regret this." It was not a threat. It was a promise. He had connections. He was a celebrated surgeon, a rainmaker for the hospital's board. She was a nurse. A very good nurse, but a disposable component in the vast, clanking machinery of the institution. He could ruin her career with a word, a whisper. He could ensure she never worked in this city again. She knew this. She had weighed this. The cost of staying was simply higher. It was then that a new sound entered the corridor. Not a squeak or a beep. It was the whisper of expensive wool and the near-silent whir of rubber on polished linoleum. It was the kind of sound that announced its own importance by being almost undetectable. Neither of them noticed at first, locked in their tableau of quiet violence. Marcus was too consumed by his rage, Ilara too focused on the pressure points of his grip. calculating her escape. But the presence asserted itself not with noise, but with a change in the very quality of the air. It was the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. From the far end of the hallway, a man in a wheelchair emerged from the private wing, pushed by a woman with an expression of serene efficiency. The man in the chair was not old or infirm. His posture, even seated, was one of absolute command. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked as if it had been tailored by architects, its lines clean and severe. His hands rested on his thighs, still and composed. A white bandage was neatly wrapped around his left hand, a stark contrast to the dark fabric. He was not looking at them. His gaze was directed forward, as if their desperate struggle was nothing more than a piece of uninteresting scenery on his path to the exit. The woman pushing him, dressed in a similar severe style, did not break her stride. They were a silent, moving island of immense gravity. They drew level with the alcove where Marcus had cornered Alara. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. Marcus, finally sensing a shift, an audience, loosened his grip slightly. His actor's instinct took over, a flicker of awareness that the scene had acquired a witness. He tried to rearrange his features back into the charming, concerned Dr. Thorne. It was too late. The mask was cracked. The man in the wheelchair did not turn his head. His eyes, a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the light, slid sideways. They did not land on Marcus. They landed on Alara. He saw the stillness of her body, the lack of panic in her eyes. He saw the quiet, profound dignity of her endurance. He saw the fortress she had built. He did not rush. He was not performing. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate in the bones of the building itself. It cut through Marcus's lingering fury like a scalpel through tissue. Let go of her arm. It was not a request. It was a correction of a fundamental error in the universe. Marcus froze. His head snapped toward the sound, his face a mask of confusion and indignation. Who was this? Some patient? How dare he interfere? "I beg your pardon," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a private conversation." The man in the wheelchair finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes met Marcus's. There was no anger in them, there was no threat. There was something far more terrifying, a complete and total absence of consideration. It was the look one gives to a piece of dust before brushing it from a sleeve. "It is no longer private," the man said, his voice as steady as iron wrapped in silk. "And you are no longer holding her arm." Behind him, 2 other men appeared. They had not been there a second before. They seemed to step out of the shadows, materializing from the ambient stillness of the corridor. They were dressed in dark suits, their movements fluid and economical. They did not look at the man in the wheelchair for instructions. They already had them. One of the men placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. It was not a violent gesture, but it had the weight of inevitability. Marcus flinched, trying to shrug it off. The hand did not move. "Get your hands off me," Marcus sputtered, his face flushing with a mixture of rage and a dawning, sickening fear. He was losing control of the narrative. This was not his scene anymore. "Dr. Thorne," the man in the wheelchair said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "You have caused a disruption. These gentlemen will escort you to your car. I suggest you go with them." The second man stepped smoothly between Marcus and Alara, creating a physical barrier. He did not look at her. His focus was entirely on neutralizing the threat. It was done with such practiced, impersonal efficiency that it was almost beautiful. Marcus looked from the impassive faces of the security men to the cold, still face of the man in the chair. He saw no purchase, no angle to play, no ego to manipulate. He was suddenly, terrifyingly out of his depth. The performative power he wielded within the hospital's hierarchy was a flickering candle against the hurricane of this man's quiet authority. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus demanded, but the words were hollow, the bravado gone. The man in the wheelchair did not answer. He simply gave a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod. The first security man tightened his grip, and Marcus was propelled backward, stumbling. his protests dying in his throat as he was guided, firmly and irrevocably, down the corridor and out of sight. The entire event took less than 15 seconds. It was a silent, bloodless coup. The corridor was suddenly vast and quiet. The two men had vanished with Marcus. Only the woman with the serene expression and the man in the wheelchair remained. The air settled. The hum of the hospital returned. Ilara finally allowed herself to breathe. It was a ragged, shuddering intake of air. Her arm throbbed where Marcus had held it. Her legs felt weak. She leaned back against the wall, the cool plaster a comfort against her back. The man in the wheelchair watched her. His expression was unreadable. It was a landscape of deep, quiet neutrality. He had not smiled. He had not shown pity. He had simply observed, assessed, and acted. He had corrected the error. "Evelyn," he said to the woman behind him. "Sir," she replied, her voice as calm as his. "Please escort Miss—" He paused, his gray eyes asking the question without his lips needing to form it. "Vance," Ilara supplied, her voice a little shaky. "Ilara Vance." "Miss Vance," he continued as if there had been no interruption. "Please escort Miss Vance to the Calloway suite. See that she has some water. And find out what she needs." The woman, Evelyn, moved to Ilara's side. "This way, Miss Vance." Ilara hesitated. The Calloway suite was the hospital's most exclusive private room reserved for benefactors and billionaires. It was a world away from the bustling wards where she worked. I should go home. My shift is over." "I believe a few moments of quiet would be beneficial," the man said. It was again not a suggestion. His gaze held hers, and for the first time she felt it was not an assessment, but a communication. It was a signal of safety. A temporary one, perhaps, but a safety she hadn't felt in years. She looked down the empty corridor where Marcus had been taken. She thought of going to the parking garage, of the drive home, of the locks on her door that suddenly felt so flimsy. She looked back at the man who commanded silence with a word. She gave a small, stiff nod. "All right." Following Evelyn, she felt the man's eyes on her back. It was not a predatory gaze. It was not a possessive one. It was something else entirely. It was the gaze of a man who recognizes a rare and valuable thing and is displeased to find it being mishandled. The Calloway suite was less a hospital room and more a luxury hotel apartment that happened to have a medical-grade bed in one corner. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender, not antiseptic. A wall of windows looked out over the city, the lights a glittering tapestry against the encroaching night. Evelyn guided her to a plush armchair and poured her a glass of water from a crystal pitcher. Her movements were precise and soothing. "Mr. Kincaid will join you shortly," Evelyn said, her voice soft. "Is there anything I can get for you? A blanket? Something to eat?" Ilara shook her head, clutching the cold glass. "No, thank you." Kincaid. The name echoed in her mind, familiar but unplaceable. It was a name associated with skyscrapers and foundations, a name that appeared in the business section of the news, not the gossip columns. Evelyn gave a slight bow of her head and retreated, closing the door with a soft click, leaving Ilara alone in the opulent silence. She looked around the room. The art on the walls was original. The furniture was bespoke. This was the quiet, structural power that dwarfed Marcus's petty tyranny. It was the difference between a regional theater actor and the man who owned the entire studio. Minutes later, the door opened again. Adrian Kincaid entered, no longer in the wheelchair. He walked with a smooth, unhurried grace, his charcoal suit unruffled. He had a presence that filled the room without crowding it. He moved to the window, his back to her for a moment, looking out at the city that was, in many ways, his. "Are you all right, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice the same low, steady thing it had been in the hall. "Yes," she said. The word felt inadequate. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." He turned from the window. "Dr. Thorne was creating a liability for this institution, and he was assaulting you. Intervention was not optional." He framed it in terms of logic and necessity, draining the emotion from it. It was a kindness. It allowed her to accept the help without feeling like a victim in need of rescue. He gestured to the chair opposite her. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat down, the picture of composure. It was only then that she saw the small, dark red spot blooming on the white bandage on his left hand. The IV site from his discharge must have reopened. The nurse in her took over, a reflex stronger than shock or fear. "Your hand is bleeding." He glanced down at it as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It appears so." "You should have that redressed before you leave," she said, her professional tone returning, a shield and a comfort. "I can do it if you'd like. I have my kit in my locker." "That won't be necessary," he said, but he didn't move. "It will only take a moment," she insisted gently. "It's the least I can do." She needed to do something, to reestablish her own competence, to be the helper, not the helped. "There should be a kid in the room." He considered her for a long moment, then gave a slight inclination of his head. "As you wish." She found the supplies in a discreet cabinet, her hands moving with familiar efficiency. She pulled a small stool over and sat before him, taking his hand in hers. His skin was warm. His hand was large, the fingers long and elegant, a strange contrast to the sense of immense strength they conveyed. She carefully began to unwrap the bandage. "My apologies for the state of the facilities," he murmured. "The CEO of this hospital has certain standards. It seems they have been slipping. I will have to speak with him." She focused on her task, cleaning the small puncture with an alcohol wipe. "I'm sure he'll be receptive." "I own the company that owns the holding firm that owns this hospital," he stated, his voice flat, a simple declaration of fact. "He will be very receptive." Alara's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. She absorbed this information. It explained the silent men, the immediate obedience, the sheer weight of his presence. He wasn't just a benefactor. He was the sovereign. She finished cleaning the site and reached for a new bandage. As she did, the light from the window caught his wrist, which was now fully exposed. And she saw it. Below the fine hairs on his forearm, just above the wrist bone, was a scar. It was old, faded to a silvery white against his skin, but its shape was unique, unforgettable. It was a jagged, angry-looking thing, shaped vaguely like a lightning bolt with a broken fork at the end. The breath caught in her throat. Her blood went cold. She had seen that scar before, not in person. She had seen it in a photograph. A faded, dog-eared picture she kept in a small wooden box with her father's medals and letters. The photo was of her father, young and smiling, his arm slung around another soldier in a dusty foreign land. Her father had a similar, smaller scar on his cheek in the photo. The other man, whose face was partially obscured by shadow, had that exact same jagged scar on his wrist, clearly visible as his hand rested on the stock of his rifle. Her father, Sergeant Thomas Vance, had died when she was 6. He had been a quiet, gentle man at home, but his letters spoke of the chaos of his service. They spoke of one man in particular, a young lieutenant from a wealthy family who had no business being there, but who moved with an unnatural calm and a strategic brilliance that defied his age. Her father didn't use his name in the letters. He just called him Sovereign. It was Sovereign who had pulled him from a burning vehicle. It was Sovereign who had held the line against impossible odds. It was Sovereign who carried the jagged scar on his wrist from a piece of shrapnel in that same explosion. Alara went pale. The world tilted on its axis. She stared at the scar, then slowly lifted her eyes to his face. He was watching her, his gray eyes missing nothing. He saw the recognition dawn. He saw the shock. He saw the pieces of her past clicking into a new, terrifying, impossible configuration. He did not confirm it. He did not deny it. He simply held her gaze, his expression unchanging. The silence in the room became a living thing, filled with the ghosts of dead soldiers and the weight of unspoken history. "Your father was a good man," Adrian Kincaid said, his voice softer than she had heard it yet. "He spoke of you often. He said you had the kindest eyes he'd ever seen." A single tear escaped her, tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. She hadn't cried in the hallway. She hadn't cried when Marcus had her pinned against the wall. But this unexpected link to a father she barely remembered broke through the fortress wall. She quickly finished applying the new bandage, her movements now slightly clumsy. She stood up, needing distance. I don't understand. You don't need to, he said, his voice regaining its steady, calm authority. He stood as well, a towering, reassuring presence. All you need to understand is this. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a simple, heavy card. It was black, with a single phone number embossed in silver. Nothing else. Dr. Thorne will not be a problem for you again. The complaint you file tomorrow will be taken very seriously. His suspension will be immediate. An investigation will find his conduct, and the conduct of those who enabled him, to be unacceptable. He will not work at this hospital or any other of merit, ever again. You have my word. She stared at the card, then at him. It was an astonishing, absolute promise. Why? My father owed your father a debt, Adrian said simply. A debt that can never truly be repaid. Consider this a small installment. He placed the card in her hand. Her fingers were cold against his. If you need anything at all, that number will find me. He gave a slight, formal nod. Evelyn will arrange a car to take you home whenever you are ready. And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the glittering city, a ghost from her father's past, and the stunning, terrifying promise of absolute protection. Alara did not call the number. For 3 days, the black card sat on her kitchen counter, a silent monolith in her small apartment. It felt like a surrender she wasn't ready to make. She had spent years learning to rely on herself, to be her own advocate, her own rescuer. The idea of accepting help on such a monumental scale felt like a betrayal of that hard-won independence. It felt like trading one form of control for another, and she was so tired of being controlled. She did as he'd said she would. The morning after the incident, her arm a canvas of mottled purple and blue, she walked into the Human Resources Department of St. Jude's Hospital and filed a formal, detailed complaint against Dr. Marcus Thorne. She attached a printed copy of the hospital's own workplace violence policy, highlighting the relevant sections. She was professional, precise, and unflinching. The HR manager, a woman with tired eyes and a practiced, sympathetic smile, took her statement. She assured Alara that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. Alara knew what that meant. It meant her complaint would be filed away in a cabinet, a paper tiger meant to placate her while the institution protected its asset. Marcus was the asset. She was the liability. She went home and waited. She waited for the phone call from the hospital administration, the one where they would tell her they'd found no evidence to support her claim. She waited for Marcus to begin his campaign of quiet, professional ruin. She waited for the world she knew to shrink and curdle around her. But the call that came was not the one she expected. It was from her unit supervisor, a woman named Carol who usually communicated in clipped, stressed-out sentences. Today, her voice was laced with a strange, flustered respect. "Ilara," she said, "there's been a development. Dr. Thorne has been placed on indefinite administrative leave, effective immediately." Ilara sat down on her sofa. "What?" "I don't have the details," Carol said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But something big came down from corporate, not just hospital admin, I mean, the top. They're auditing his entire department. His research grants are frozen. It's a mess." Ilara looked at the black card on her counter. He had not waited for her to ask. He had simply acted. The sheer, silent efficiency of it was breathtaking. From his penthouse office overlooking the city, Adrian Kincaid reviewed the morning's reports on his tablet. Evelyn stood silently by his desk, a second tablet in her hands. "The preliminary audit of Thorne's research funding shows significant irregularities," Evelyn reported, her voice calm. "Embezzlement, falsified data. He was sloppy, arrogant. He was protected," Adrian corrected quietly, not looking up from his screen. "The hospital's board was complicit. They valued his prestige over their integrity. He swiped to a new page, a list of names. Have we acquired the majority stake in the holding company for MedTech Innovations? The transaction was finalized at 3 a.m. this morning, Evelyn confirmed. We now control 62%. It was Dr. Thorne's primary source of outside income, a vanity project mostly. Liquidate his shares, Adrian said. Call in the outstanding development loans, all of them. Sir, Evelyn said, a flicker of something almost like curiosity in her professional gaze. The man is already ruined. This seems comprehensive. Adrian finally looked up. His gray eyes were like a winter sky. My father's file on Sergeant Vance described him as a man of uncommon decency. It also described his daughter, Ilara. He sent photos, wrote about her first steps, her first words. After Sergeant Vance's death, my father attempted to provide for his family. His widow, Ilara's mother, was proud. She refused. My father respected her wishes, but he never forgave himself for it. He considered it a failure of his duty. He looked back at his tablet. I do not fail in my duties. Dismantle Thorne's life, every piece, and find a way to offer Miss Vance a position that she will not be able to refuse out of pride, something she has earned, something that is hers. Yes, sir, Evelyn said, the curiosity replaced by understanding. She was already tapping on her tablet, executing the quiet commands. The gears of a vast and silent machine were grinding a man's world into dust. Ilara's relief was short-lived. 2 days later, she received another call. It was HR again. Her complaint had been validated, they said. But in the course of their thorough investigation, they had uncovered a potential conflict of interest regarding her relationship with Dr. Thorne. She was being suspended with pay pending a full review. She knew exactly what it was. It was the system fighting back, a last gasp of the old power structure. They couldn't protect Marcus directly anymore, not against the corporate behemoth that was suddenly breathing down their necks, but they could punish her, they could isolate her, bury her in procedure, make her an example. The pay, they assured her, would continue. It did for 1 week. Then a letter arrived. Due to accounting errors discovered during the ongoing audit, all non-essential payroll, including suspended staff, was temporarily frozen. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, bureaucratic strangulation. Within a month, her savings were gone. An eviction notice was taped to her door. She stood in her kitchen, the flimsy paper in her hand, the black card on the counter seeming to mock her. She had tried to do it herself. She had tried to play by the rules of a game that was rigged against her, and she had lost. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her independence had led her to a dead end. With a hand that trembled slightly, she picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang only once. A man's voice, professional and calm, answered. Yes? My name is Ilara Vance, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. I was given this number by Mr. Kincaid. We are aware, Miss Vance, the voice said. A car is on its way. It will arrive in 5 minutes. Please pack a small bag for a few days. The line went dead. She was stunned into obedience. She moved through her apartment in a daze, throwing a few clothes, her toiletries, and the small wooden box containing her father's things into an overnight bag. Exactly 5 minutes later, a sleek black car, the kind that purrs rather than rumbles, pulled up to the curb outside her building. The driver, a man with the same quiet professionalism as the voice on the phone, opened the door for her without a word. She was not taken to a downtown office or a sterile hotel. The car sped out of the city, eating up the miles of highway before turning onto a series of winding country roads. The landscape softened into rolling hills and old-growth forests. Finally, it slowed before a pair of immense wrought-iron gates set into a high stone wall. There was no sign, no name. The gates swung open silently, and the car proceeded up a long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees. The house, no, it was an estate, was a masterpiece of old stone and modern glass. It sat on a rise overlooking a serene private lake, a perfect fusion of history and contemporary design. It was not ostentatious. It was solid, permanent. The car pulled to a stop before the main entrance. The driver opened her door. As she stepped out, the massive front door of the house opened, and an older woman with elegant silver hair and the same startling gray eyes as Adrian Kincaid stepped out. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely cut cashmere dress. She smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her eyes. "Ilara," the woman said, her voice rich with a gentle authority. "I'm Eleanor Kincaid, Adrian's mother. We've been waiting for you." Ilara was speechless. Eleanor Kincaid walked toward her and took both of her hands. Her touch was warm and firm. "You have your father's eyes," Eleanor said softly. "He was a very brave man, and my husband was very fond of him, as was my son." She looked at the small worn bag in Ilara's hand, then at the eviction notice still faintly crumpled in her other hand. Her expression hardened for a fraction of a second. "The world can be an unkind place for good people. Come inside. You are safe here." Ilara was led into a home that felt less like a house and more like a sanctuary. There was art and books everywhere. A fire crackled in a huge stone hearth. The air smelled of old wood, beeswax, and fresh flowers. Eleanor showed her to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, with a balcony that overlooked the lake. "Rest," Eleanor said gently. "Adrian is in London for the day. He will be back this evening. We will have dinner together. We have much to talk about, you and I. But for now, just breathe. This is your home for as long as you need it." That evening, Ilara found herself sitting at a long, polished oak table in a dining room with glass walls that looked out into the darkening forest. She wore a simple dress she had packed, feeling plain and out of place amidst the quiet elegance. Eleanor sat at one end of the table. The seat at the other end was empty. They spoke of small things. Eleanor asked about her nursing career, not with polite interest, but with a deep, genuine curiosity. She asked about Ilara's passions, her frustrations with the healthcare system, her ideas for how it could be better. Ilara, hesitant at first, found herself opening up, describing her dream of a small, community-focused clinic that treated people with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay. Eleanor listened, her chin resting on her hand, her gray eyes thoughtful. "That is a worthy dream," she said. "It is the kind of thing that lasts." Just then, the soft sound of footsteps announced Adrian's arrival. He entered the room, shrugging off a dark blue suit jacket and handing it to an attendant. He had loosened his tie. He looked tired, but his presence was as potent as ever. His eyes found Ilara immediately. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. "Ilara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded different in his low, resonant voice. Solid. "I'm glad you called." He took his seat at the head of the table. Dinner was served, a simple but delicious meal. The conversation was not the stilted, awkward affair Ilara had dreaded. They did not speak of Marcus Thorne. They did not speak of the hospital or the eviction. Instead, Adrian asked her about the book she was reading, which he had noticed on her bedside table. It was a dense history of architectural theory. He knew the author. He had met him. He began to speak about the principles of structure and space, of how a building can shape the lives of the people within it. He spoke of light and shadow, of materials that endure. Ilara, who had always had a layperson's passion for the subject, found herself engaged in a real, peer-to-peer conversation. He was not condescending. He was not trying to impress her. He was simply sharing an interest. She saw a side of him that was not the quiet sovereign or the ruthless CEO. She saw the man who read history, who appreciated art, who understood the poetry of a well-designed building. He, in turn, saw the keen, analytical mind behind her gentle exterior. He saw the woman who understood systems, whether it was the circulatory system of a human body or the social system of a hospital. He was seeing her correctly for the first time. The slow burn of this recognition was more intoxicating than any whirlwind romance. It was a quiet, profound meeting of minds. Drop a heart in the comments if you believe that being truly seen is the most romantic thing of all. If this story is moving you, please hit that like button right now. Your support helps us bring more stories like Alara's to life. After dinner, Eleanor retired, leaving them alone. They walked out onto a wide stone terrace that overlooked the dark, glassy surface of the lake. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. "My mother likes you," Adrian said. It was a simple statement, but it felt significant. "She's very kind," Alara said, hugging her arms against the chill. He disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a heavy cashmere blanket, which he draped around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her neck, a brief, warm touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "I don't leave because things become complicated," he said, his voice low. He was not looking at her, but out at the lake. "I did not want to interfere. I wanted you to have the victory on your own terms, but the system is designed to protect men like Thorne. It is a flawed architecture. I apologize that my intervention became necessary." She looked at his profile in the moonlight, the strong line of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes. "You apologize for saving me?" "I apologize for the world being a place that required you to be saved," he corrected. "You should have been celebrated. Instead, you were punished for your competence." He turned to face her. "That will not happen again." In his gaze, she found not ownership or pity, but a deep, abiding respect. It was a disorienting, powerful thing. It was the feeling of standing on solid ground after years at sea. And she realized with a jolt that this quiet, dangerous, complicated man was the safest place she had ever been. Marcus Thorne did not understand what was happening. His world was dissolving around him, the foundations turning to sand. His suspension from the hospital was supposed to be a formality, a slap on the wrist. But the internal investigation was being led by a team of ruthless auditors from the parent corporation, people who couldn't be charmed or intimidated. They were pulling apart his career thread by thread, and they were enjoying it. His research funding was gone. His private company, MedTech, had imploded overnight. The board had been replaced, the loans called in, and he was facing personal bankruptcy. His colleagues, the ones who had slapped him on the back and laughed at his jokes, now wouldn't meet his eye. He was a pariah. And it was all her fault. This was the core of his delusion, the hill his arrogance would die on. It had to be Alara. She must have found some dirt on him, some small piece of leverage, and passed it to a rival. He could not conceive of a power so vast and so disinterested that it would crush him as a matter of principle. In his mind, this was personal. It was a petty revenge enacted by a woman he had scorned. "Give her 3 days," he had boasted to the one friend who would still take his calls. "She'll come crawling back. She can't survive without me." 3 days turned into a week, then a month. There was no call, no text. She had simply vanished. This, more than the financial ruin, was what drove him mad. His property had been stolen. The narrative he had built for himself, the one where he was the benevolent master of his own universe, had been shattered. Blinded by this rage, he made his final, fatal miscalculation. He hired a private investigator, a seedy man who promised results. "Find her," Marcus ordered, his voice raw with obsession. "I don't care what it costs." The investigator was good at his job. He followed the faint paper trail Alara had left. He discovered the suspension, the frozen pay, the eviction. He found the record of the black car. Through a contact at the DMV, he traced the plates. They were registered to a shell corporation, which was owned by another shell corporation, which was a subsidiary of Kincaid Global. The investigator drove out to the Kincaid estate. He sat in his car a mile down the road, using a long lens camera to photograph the gate. He felt a thrill of victory. He had found her. He was about to call Marcus when a black SUV pulled up silently beside his car. 2 men in dark suits got out. They did not draw weapons. They did not raise their voices. One of them tapped on his window. "Mr. Harris," the man said, his voice pleasant, "you appear to be lost, and you've dropped your camera." He opened the car door, took the camera, and removed the memory card, crushing it between his thumb and forefinger. Mr. Kincaid values his privacy. He also believes in second chances. This is yours. Leave this county. Forget the name Vance. Forget Kincaid. If you do not, your next meeting will be with men far less patient than we are. The investigator, a man who had seen his share of ugly things, felt a cold dread he had never known. This was not the hired muscle of a jealous husband. This was something else entirely. This was corporate, structural, absolute. He started his car and drove away, and he did not look back. When he called Marcus, he lied. She's gone, vanished, no trail. He took the money and disappeared himself. Marcus, however, was not deterred. If he couldn't find her, he would force her to come to him. He learned through the society pages that the hospital's annual fundraiser, the Obsidian Gala, was approaching. It was the pinnacle of the city's social calendar. And the guest of honor, the event's primary underwriter, was Adrian Kincaid. A sick, twisted certainty formed in his mind. Kincaid, the man from the hallway, the man who owned everything. He had taken her. It was the only explanation that made sense to his shattered ego. Kincaid had seen his prize and simply taken it. He would go to the gala. He was still technically an employee of the hospital, albeit a suspended one. His invitation had been revoked, but he knew the layout. He knew the service entrances. He would crash the party. He would find Alara, draped on the arm of her billionaire benefactor, and he would expose her. He would reclaim her. He would confront them both in front of the entire city. In his fevered imagination, it was a heroic, dramatic scene. He would be the wronged man, fighting for what was his. The world would see the truth, and his life would be restored. This was the trap, and he was walking into it of his own volition. In the library of the Kincaid estate, a room lined with thousands of books from floor to ceiling, Adrian looked up from a document he was signing. Evelyn stood before him. "Thorne's investigator has been neutralized," she reported. "And as you predicted, Thorne has turned his attention to the Obsidian Gala. He's been making inquiries about security protocols. He intends to gain unauthorized entry." Adrian finished his signature with a flourish of black ink. "Let him," he said. "Change the security rotation on the West Service corridor. Ensure the door is accessible. And confirm that the media pit has a clear, unobstructed view of my table." "Sir?" Evelyn asked, the barest hint of a question in her tone. "Dr. Thorne is a performer," Adrian said, capping his pen. "He is desperate for an audience. It would be rude not to provide him with one." He stood and walked to the window, which looked out onto a garden where Alara was sketching in a notebook, her face serene in the afternoon sun. He had commissioned a team of architects to draft plans for her community clinic based on her ideas. She was reviewing the initial concepts. She was not a prize to be won. She was a partner to be valued. Marcus Thorne had mistaken a queen for a pawn. It was a fatal error in judgment. That evening, he approached her in the garden. "I have a favor to ask," he said, his voice unusually gentle. She looked up from her sketches, a smudge of graphite on her cheek. "Anything." "The hospital is hosting its annual gala," he said. "As the new principal stakeholder, my attendance is required. I would be honored if you would accompany me." She hesitated. The thought of returning to that world, of facing the whispers and the stares, was daunting. "I don't know, Adrian. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You are more than ready," he said, his gaze steady and reassuring. "You will not be a guest. You will be my partner, and it is time the world saw you as such." He paused. "And I have it on good authority that the architect of your clinic, a brilliant woman from Zurich, will be there. I thought you might like to meet her." He was not commanding her. He was inviting her. He was creating an opportunity for her, not for him. She looked at the strength and decency in his face, and she felt a wave of profound gratitude. "Okay," she said, a real smile reaching her eyes. "I'll go." On the night of the gala, a box arrived at her room. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a gown of emerald green silk. It was architecturally precise, a marvel of understated design that was both elegant and powerful. It was a dress that did not ask for attention, but commanded it. It was a dress that said, "I belong here." When she came down the grand staircase, Adrian was waiting at the bottom. He was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the picture of quiet, devastating power. He watched her descend, and for the first time, she saw an unguarded emotion in his eyes. It was awe. "Elara," he breathed. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. "You are magnificent." The grand ballroom of the hotel was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and expensive jewelry. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as Adrian Kincaid and the stunning unknown woman on his arm made their entrance. The air crackled with curiosity. Who was she? Adrian guided her to their table, front and center, a small island of calm in the swirling social currents. He was a gracious host, introducing Elara not as a date, but as his respected partner to a parade of the city's most powerful figures. He spoke of her brilliance, her insight, her vision for the new community health foundation he was launching. He was not just protecting her, he was elevating her, placing her on the pedestal she had earned but had always been denied. She felt a sense of rightness, a feeling of being correctly placed in the world. The fear she had anticipated was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She belonged here, at his side. Then, across the room, a disturbance, a commotion near a service door. A man's voice raised in anger. Marcus Thorne, his tuxedo rumpled, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild with a manic gleam, shoved his way through the crowd. He looked like a ghost at the feast, a specter of his former self. All his polished charm had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, desperate hunger of his ego. He spotted them. His eyes locked on Elara, resplendent in her emerald gown, sitting at Adrian Kincaid's side. The sight seemed to break something inside him. This was the ultimate betrayal. His possession, not just stolen, but polished and displayed as a treasure. He stormed toward their table, ignoring the gasps and the security guards who were now scrambling to intercept him. The trap had been sprung. The media pit, with its dozens of cameras, had a perfect, direct line of sight. "Elara!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The entire ballroom fell silent. The music faltered and died. He reached their table, his chest heaving. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "What are you doing with him? After everything I did for you?" He turned his fury on Adrian. "And you! You think you can just buy whatever you want? She is with me!" He lunged, not for Adrian, but for Elara. He grabbed her arm, the same arm he had bruised in the hospital corridor. "You are coming with me. You have an obligation. You are mine." Elara did not flinch. She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his frantic, pathetic face, and she felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. Before anyone could react, Adrian Kincaid moved. He did not stand up. He simply leaned forward, his presence suddenly immense, a vortex of absolute authority that drew all the energy in the room toward him. He placed his hand over Marcus's on Elara's arm. "Take your hand off my wife," he said. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the room. "Wife!" Marcus froze, his eyes wide with shock. He looked from Adrian to Elara, whose own expression was one of stunned surprise. Adrian's grip tightened on Marcus's hand, his fingers like steel. "I believe I gave you an instruction, Dr. Thorne." He squeezed, and Marcus cried out, his fingers going numb. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. Adrian Kincaid then stood up, a slow, deliberate movement. He was a full head taller than Marcus, a monolith of dark, controlled power. The cameras flashed, capturing the tableau, the broken, desperate doctor and the quiet, immovable sovereign. "Sit down, Marcus," Adrian said. It was not a command filled with anger. It was the voice of a man explaining a complex but immutable law of physics. You wanted an audience. You have one. Now listen. He began to speak, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the silent ballroom. 3 weeks ago, Kincaid Global completed its acquisition of the North American Hospital Group, the parent corporation of St. Jude's. As of that moment, you became my employee. He paused, letting the words sink in. Marcus's face went slack. As the new owner, Adrian continued, I ordered a full review of all personnel files. Yours was illuminating. A pattern of harassment, of abuse of authority, of financial misconduct. A pattern that the previous administration was content to ignore. I am not. He took out his phone, a sleek black device, and held it up. This is a copy of the termination order filed with the board this afternoon. Your employment at St. Jude's is over. Your medical license is under review by a board that, I can assure you, will find your conduct indefensible. Marcus began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking. But we both know your real money wasn't in your salary. Adrian went on, his voice relentless, methodical. It was in your little side project, MedTech Innovations. He swiped the screen. As of last month, my venture capital division acquired a majority stake in that company as well. We discovered, to our profound disappointment, that the company was on the verge of insolvency. We also discovered you had personally guaranteed the development loans. He looked Marcus directly in the eye. We are calling those notes due, all of them, at midnight tonight. The color drained from Marcus's face. He understood. It wasn't just his job. It was everything. His company, his house, his cars, his entire hollow, performative life. You are a man of no assets and significant liabilities, Adrian stated, his voice devoid of emotion. You have no job. You have no company. You have no reputation. You are, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. Marcus Thorne stared at him, his mouth opening and closing silently. The truth of his absolute ruin washed over him, a tidal wave of cold, black water. The arrogance that had sustained him his entire life crumbled into dust, leaving nothing behind. He dropped to his knees. A terrible, guttural sob escaped him. He covered his face with his hands and began to weep, his body shaking with racking, pathetic cries. He was no longer a tyrant or a surgeon or a man of importance. He was just a broken thing, kneeling on the floor of a grand ballroom, his life dismantled in under 5 minutes by a few quiet words. Adrian watched him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a subtle nod. The 2 security men who had been standing by moved in. They gently but firmly lifted the sobbing Marcus to his feet and began to lead him away, a disgraced and broken man being escorted from the stage of his own final, disastrous performance. The silence that descended upon the ballroom was absolute. It was the silence of shock, of awe, of a public execution carried out with surgical precision. Every eye was on Adrian Kincaid, who stood unmoved beside the woman in the emerald gown. He turned, not to the audience, but to Ilara. He gently took her arm, the one Marcus had grabbed, and his thumb brushed over the skin as if to erase the memory of the touch. Her heart was hammering in her chest, not from fear, but from the sheer, stunning force of his protection. Wife! The word echoed in her mind. Then, Adrian turned to face the stunned crowd. His hand moved to the small of her back, a warm, solid, reassuring pressure. He raised his voice, just enough to be heard in every corner of the silent room. I would like to apologize for the interruption, he said, his voice the epitome of calm command. And I would like to take this moment to properly introduce my partner, Ilara Vance. He looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes was for her alone. For the past 5 years, she has been the most competent and compassionate nurse at St. Jude's, despite an environment that failed to recognize her value, a failure which, as the new owner, I intend to correct personally. She is also the chief architect of the new Kincaid Family Foundation for Community Health, which will break ground next month on its first free clinic, a project born from her vision and her brilliance. He was not just clearing her name. He was building her a throne. He was taking the quiet competence that Marcus had exploited and turning it into a public monument. He was telling the world not just who she was with, but who she was. A smattering of applause started, hesitant at first, then growing into a wave of thunderous ovation. It wasn't for him, it was for her. It was for the story they had just witnessed, the fall of a petty tyrant and the rise of a quiet, deserving queen. Alara stood in the warm spotlight, the sound washing over her, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt seen. Completely and utterly seen. Later that night, they stood on the private terrace of Adrian's penthouse, a space that felt like it was suspended among the stars. The city glittered below them, a silent, sprawling kingdom. The noise of the gala, of her past, of Marcus Thorne's pathetic collapse, was a world away. There was only the cool night air and the solid presence of the man beside her. She finally found her voice. "Wife?" she asked, a faint smile playing on her lips. Adrian turned to her, his expression serious. It was a strategic declaration in a moment of conflict. An overstep, perhaps. For which I apologize. He paused, his gray eyes searching hers. Unless you would prefer, I did not. The air between them shimmered. This was not a proposal born of passion or romance in the traditional sense. It was something deeper. It was an alignment of souls, a partnership, a recognition of mutual respect and profound safety. "I do not prefer you apologize," she said softly. A slow smile spread across his face, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his severe features. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It felt like coming home. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and a long, slow breath she felt like she had been holding for years finally escaped her. The weight was gone. The fortress inside her dissolved, not because it was breached, but because it was no longer needed. The peace was real. It was earned. The story did not end there. It began. Their wedding was a quiet affair, held at the estate with only his mother and her friend Lena as witnesses. Her life was not subsumed by his, it was amplified. The Kincaid Family Foundation became her domain. She oversaw the construction of the first clinic, then a second, then a third. She used her quiet competence, her deep empathy, and his limitless resources to build an institution of care and dignity that changed the landscape of healthcare in the city. He never tried to run her life. He simply removed the obstacles from her path. He was the silent, unbreachable wall at her back, the deep, solid foundation upon which she could build her dreams. She, in turn, brought a warmth and a light into his controlled, orderly world. She challenged his cynicism. She made him laugh, a low, rumbling sound that she came to cherish. She was the architect of his heart, just as she was the architect of her clinics. One evening, a year later, she found him in his library, staring at the old, faded photograph of her father and him. He had framed it and placed it on his desk. "He would be proud of you, Alara," Adrian said quietly, without looking up. She came and stood behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "He'd be proud of us," she corrected. She looked at the two young men in the photo, boys forged into men by chaos and fire, and then at the man her husband had become, a man who used his immense power not for gain, but for protection, not to acquire, but to build. Some people will take your silence for weakness and your grace for compliance. They will build their castles on your quiet endurance, never realizing that you are the bedrock that allows them to stand. But one day, the ground will shift. The right person will not see a victim to be saved, but a sovereign to be recognized. They will not offer you a cage, no matter how gilded. They will offer you a kingdom to build yourself, and they will stand guard at the gate. What did you think of Adrian's final, devastating monologue at the gala? Let us know in the comments what you think he should do with Marcus Thorne's now worthless company. If this story of justice and vindication moved you, please hit that like button right now. It means the world to us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that button so you never miss what comes next. The story of Alara and Adrian is just beginning, and the rise of the Kincaid Health Foundation is coming. You won't want to miss it.